friends, it's the Stitches. Today I have 5 sustainable sewing tips. People are always asking me how to make sewing more sustainable, and I don't have all of the answers when it comes to sustainable sewing because sewing in and of itself is more sustainable than buying pre-made clothing. But if you really want to have a very sustainable lifestyle, then it's definitely good to keep things in mind in all areas of your life. So tip number 1 is to source your tools and your materials secondhand whenever you can. Independent thrift stores and thrift stores like the Salvation Army are well known for carrying a wide variety of craft supplies. Some thrift stores will throw away the craft supplies that get donated to them because they don't feel like they'll sell. Places like Goodwill used to carry things like patterns and material, but a lot of them don't anymore. There are also lots of them that do. I know Value Village / Savers does occasionally have stuff like that. I used to get all of my like zippers and things from there. One of the challenges with buying thrift store fabric is that you don't know the fiber content just from looking at it. So if you can, take a small square of it and carefully burn it over like a sink or something. Use some metal tongs to hold it, and then, you know, a lighter or a match or whatever so that you don't have to like touch it, because some of them go up really fast, so you don't want to like burn yourself, especially if it's like a nylon. Nylon basically eviscerates the second that it touches fire, so be very careful, especially if you really don't know the content. But there are lots of guides online about IDing fiber content based on how the fabric burns, and that really is the best way to test and figure out if something is synthetic or natural or a blend, what kind of natural, what kind of synthetic, because every different major category of fabric will burn a bit uniquely. Like polyester kind of looks like fireworks, nylon just melts, wool kind of turns into like a char, whereas cotton basically turns into ash. It's very interesting. And you want to know the fiber content so that you know how to properly care for your fabric before and after you make a garment out of it. You can also use places like the Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist to source things like dress forms and sewing machines and any bigger, heavier things. Cutting tables, sewing machine tables, these are all great things to source locally via Facebook Marketplace. Another thing to keep in mind when it comes to buying things secondhand, there are all kinds of measuring tapes that you can buy secondhand. But some measuring tapes, especially vintage ones, can stretch over time just depending on what kind of material it's made out of. So compare your measuring tape to like a wooden ruler or a meter stick or something that doesn't stretch so that you know if it's actually accurate before you start using it. Because if you use a measuring tape that's been stretched out, it's obviously not going to give you good results. Tip number 2 is to get creative with upcycling. Used bed sheets are king. They're one of my favorite things. The idea that you can't make clothing out of bedsheet fabric or home decor fabric is a bold-faced lie. A lot of people will say it's because of the thread count, and if you try to use it on a sewing machine, then the needle will just break all the fibers and it'll make the fabric weaker. And like, none of those arguments really make sense when you start to actually analyze them and think about it, especially when you consider that older fabrics back in the day had a much denser weight to it. Modern day fabric is pretty loosely woven and most of it is pretty garbage quality. Also, like, if your needle is breaking threads, then you probably just have a dull needle. Things like sheer curtains make the best petticoats, and you can usually get tons and tons of fabric for crazy cheap. Things like studs can be rescued from old belts and reused. Not all hardware on fabric can be recycled, especially things like grommets, but if you have studs, little pyramid studs like these, then you can just kind of peel back the little metal shank on the back and pull them out of the belt and reuse them on other garments. The same thing can be said of things like belt buckles. If you see a belt that's really worn but it has a really interesting buckle, you can take the buckle off of the worn fabric and put it on new fabric. You can also obviously recreate clothing that already exists. Tip number 3 is to just save stuff. If you have a garment in your wardrobe that becomes irreparable, you know, you can save the buttons off of it. You can save as much of the fabric as you can to reuse as like face wipes or rags or things like that. Zippers, hardware, these are all things that can be reused and repurposed into other garments in the future. You can also save things like serger fluff and scraps to make your own pressing ham and sleeve roll. They're very useful things, but they're kind of hard to find good ones, and they're not really like a necessity if you're a new sewer. But if you make enough projects before you get to that point, then you will be able to create your own from basically the things that most people would throw away. Just try to keep an open mind and consider the second lives that things around your house can have after they've reached the end of their first life. Obviously, don't become a hoarder. Like, sometimes garbage is just garbage, but a lot of times things can be repurposed and reused in a lot of different ways if you just kind of think outside the box. Tip 4 is to plan your fabric usage carefully. Try to conserve as much fabric as possible when cutting out your pieces. And try to cut pattern pieces in such a way that any leftover fabric is like as solid and together as possible, instead of being just like a bunch of random strips of nothing. These can be reserved for other things like collar linings, pockets, things that aren't really going to be seen, you know, facings. Also use zero waste patterning techniques as much as possible. Zero waste patterns are patterns that are created solely out of rectangles and straight lines, and they kind of interconnect with each other in such a way that it uses as little fabric as possible. Fabric recycling is surprisingly sparse. Where I live, there's no place that I can actually recycle fabric locally. I have to like save it up and ship it out somewhere, and usually that's just not like an accessible thing for me. So I try to just reuse as much as I possibly can. And if at all possible, use natural and recycled materials before you use any synthetic materials. It's obviously like really hard to avoid synthetics, but if you can, absolutely take the opportunity to do that. If you have to buy new materials, it's actually surprisingly easy to find things like organic cotton and recycled polyester. They're not as common as other fabrics, but they absolutely are out there, especially in solid colors. Look for local fabric shops that also sell offcuts. Offcuts are what's left over after a larger garment producer makes all of the clothing in an order, and it's just whatever fabric they have left. It's usually just whatever's at the end of a bolt, and there wasn't enough to make a full garment out of it, so it's considered waste fabric. So this is all waste from the textile industry that normally would go to landfill, but there are places where it is auctioned off, and small companies that sell fabric can buy it and retail it in their smaller shops. But first and foremost, always do not buy any new fabric unless you already have a plan for how you're going to use it. And an immediate plan, not a, I think I would like to make a skirt out of this someday. Like, I'd like to make a skirt out of this next week when I have my day off to do that. If you avoid buying fabric that you have no plan for, then you avoid having just loose fabric in your house taking up space that could have gone to somebody else that would have used it more immediately. And that's all I have for today's video. I hope this was enjoyable and informative, and I will see you all next time. Bye!